Coming up, if it bleeds, it leads. If it makes the U.S. or President Trump look bad, especially if it's running in a left-leaning paper like the New York Times, it's a go-to story. In the words of Don Henley, we all know that crap is king. Give us dirty laundry. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's start with something other than what we've all been hearing about nonstop. Let's start with something other than COVID-19. Let's talk about a subject that we haven't covered for a while here at Political Spirits. That subject is allowing biological males who are transgender females to compete against biological females in girls' and women's sports. The development that brings this subject to the fore this week is that the U.S. Department of Justice has joined the lawsuit against the school rule in Connecticut allowing biological males who identify as female to compete in girls' sporting events. The Justice Department has filed a statement of interest in which it contends that the Connecticut rule violates Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972, the law that is universally referred to simply as Title IX, and which states that, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. What makes the Justice Department's position particularly interesting is that the law that it argues Connecticut is breaking, Title IX, is the very law Connecticut contended required it to adopt its policy, allowing biological males to compete against biological females in women's sports. So the state says that federal law requires it to do something, and the federal government says that the state broke federal law by doing it. In a single legal nutshell, that disagreement encapsulates the breadth of the political divide in this country and that it doesn't stop when it comes to legal interpretations. The Department of Justice position that the Connecticut rule allowing biological males who identify as female to compete in girls' sports violates Title IX strikes me as obvious. It's what I've believed since I first read about the Connecticut position and was shocked by it, and read with dismay the stories of girls in Connecticut track competitions who've trained for years, trying to improve enough to win a gold medal in the state championships, falling just short, redoubling their efforts, improving their times, and then coming back the following year only to be figuratively blown off the track by biological males who identify as female and who dominated the competition, notwithstanding the fact that they were never serious contenders for championships against male competition. I've covered the fundamental unfairness of the Connecticut rule in prior episodes, including extensive citation of biomechanical and sports performance experts, as well as quoting from and referencing the training regimens of one of the greatest coaches of all time in men's or women's athletics, legendary University of Tennessee women's basketball coach Pat Summitt, to demonstrate the physical and athletic performance differences between males and females. The differences are extensive, and the male advantage is massive. It extends not just to strength, but to biomechanical leverage based on narrow hips providing a direct line of thrust for sprinting and running in general, to larger lungs for a more plentiful supply of oxygen, just to name a few of the physical advantages. They can't be denied. And the United States Department of Justice hasn't denied them. It has recognized them. The Department of Justice filing states that the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference's interpretation of Title IX provides that, quote, schools may not account for the real physiological differences between men and women, Instead, schools must have certain biological males, namely those publicly identify as female, compete against biological females, close quote. It goes on, quote, in so doing, CIAC deprives those women of the single-sex athletic competitions that are one of the marquee accomplishments of Title IX, close quote. As the Justice Department filing explains, CIAC is incorrect when it contends that Title IX required it to allow trans females who were biological males to compete against biological females in girls' sports. As the DOJ explains, quote, Title IX and its implementing regulations prohibit discrimination solely on the basis of sex, not on the basis of transgender status, and therefore neither require nor authorize CIAC's transgender policy. To the contrary, CIAC's construction of Title IX, in requiring the participation of students on athletic teams that reflect their gender identity, would turn the statute on its head, close quote. The DOJ notes that, quote, because of the physiological differences between men and women, the existence of women's sports permits women to participate more fully in athletics than they otherwise could, close quote. The DOJ then engages in an evaluation and explanation of the history of the Act, which was passed in 1972, to show that the word sex in the Act was intended to refer to biological sex. It's amazing to me that the DOJ even had to go through the effort of explaining something so obvious. There is absolutely no reasonable argument that when Congress enacted Title IX in 1972, that they were contemplating it requiring or even allowing biological males to compete against biological females in women's sports. The argument that Congress was thinking of gender identity when they wrote the word sex in the bill in 1972 is so absurd that it's astonishing to me that anyone could take the argument seriously. But that is the level of political divide that has extended to legal analysis in modern America. The bottom line is that the CIAC and transgender activists and many Democrat leaders and virtually every Democrat representative in Congress supports biological males who identify as female being allowed to compete against biological females in women's sports. And many of them argue that Title IX, a law designed to ensure that girls and women have women's sports available in college and below in numbers comparable to men's sports, actually requires those schools to allow biological men to compete against girls and women in those girls and women's sporting events. That's not just wrong, it's nuts. Let's hope that the courts agree with the Department of Justice and with the plaintiffs and overturn this absurd rule of the Connecticut Interscholastic Athletic Conference. We'll update you when the court renders a decision. Next topic. No passage from India. We've talked in past episodes about why we must eliminate our dependence on China for pharmaceutical products. We can't leave ourselves open again in a situation where there's a pandemic. And not only do we not have the manufacturing capability in place in the U.S. to provide all of the medicines that Americans need, but even worse, the primary supplier of many of the medicines or components of critical medicines is our primary international rival, China. And keep in mind that it's not simply a problem because of the medicines we need for response to the pandemic itself. We also need critical medicines for all sorts of physical maladies, including heart disease, for example. And we are dependent on China for components of the medicine to treat that disease. And it's not simply a problem because of a pandemic. What if our current conflicts with China, which, ignoring the pandemic for a moment, include trade disputes, currency manipulation, and theft of intellectual property, just to name a few, were to expand to open conflict regarding Taiwan, for example? What would China do? Do you think our supply of critical medicines might be threatened? How could any politician not recognize the potential for such a threat? So why don't we just force drug manufacturers supplying the U.S. to build manufacturing facilities in other countries with inexpensive labor, but outside of China, rather than manufacturing the medicines in the U.S.? After all, that would probably be cheaper. Well, it would be better than manufacturing them in China, especially if the manufacturing was distributed to multiple countries to reduce the likelihood of conflict eliminating the supply of critical medications, but it wouldn't solve the problem. Why? Because the problem isn't just China. If you're like me, you've been following with great interest the potential for hydroxychloroquine in combination with Zithromax, aka azithromycin, to treat COVID-19 patients. President Trump has been very positive about it. There are 2 small studies out of France which show very positive results, and anecdotal evidence from individual patients in the U.S. raving about the positive effects of the medication on their symptoms, including one from Florida. Moreover, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the immunologist who's been prominently featured on the presidential coronavirus response team and is also the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, made clear that he absolutely would prescribe the medication in the right circumstances if he were treating a patient with COVID-19. So with that background, it's obvious that hydroxychloroquine is a medicine that we need in significant supply, potentially enormous supply if the results from 2 small French studies end up being replicated in the U.S. With that in mind, what did the government of one of the countries which is most supportive of the U.S. recently do? I'm talking about India, the country where just over a month ago, Indian Prime Minister Modi met with President Trump in the world's largest cricket stadium. Thousands upon thousands of roaring Indian citizens, up to 125,000 of them, greeted President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. Believe it or not, the music upon President Trump entering the stadium included the Village People's Macho Man. So why do I go into all of this background? Because I'm trying to point out that this support for President Trump and the goodwill towards America from within India is widespread and extensive, likely well beyond what you would find in blue state America. And I want you to have that perspective in mind when I tell you what I'm about to tell you. Go to the March 25 edition of India Today, and you'll find that India has banned the export of hydroxychloroquine. The message is clear. When it really hits the fan and massive numbers of lives are on the line, countries will protect their own and leave others, even their friends, to fend for themselves if they believe exporting medications to support them will threaten their own populations. A pandemic isn't like a war where you have to unite to fight a common enemy. Otherwise, it can pick you off one by one. In a pandemic, you can better your position by walling your country off from those who are hit first. With that in mind, any politician who allows the situation to continue where we as a country are dependent on other countries for manufacture of critical medications and components of critical medications is a politician whose tenure needs to end. Performance matters. And if a politician can't adjust to changing circumstances that reveal serious threats, then they need to be voted out of office. I've lost track of the number of times the United States has been referred to critically or jokingly as the most medicated nation on earth, and I don't doubt that we are. But there's going to have to be a price for pharmaceutical companies to have access to this incredibly large medical market, and that price is going to have to be manufacturing critical medicines and their components within the U.S. if they intend to sell critical medicines to the U.S. Next topic. Media games. The media is known for playing games. It's known for bias. It's been biased to the left for decades, and more recently, especially in the age of President Trump, has reached the point where it is in essence the opposition party. There is no doubt that a free news media is critical to the functioning of a democracy or republic, and for that reason, journalism, practiced as journalism, should be held in high regard. But unfortunately, it's rarely practiced that way anymore. The point of journalism is for it to speak truth to power, not to pick a side and tell only stories which advance that side, or slant stories so that they advance that side, or worst of all, flat out make up stories. But all of those things happen, and they happen far too often. And unfortunately, they've continued to happen throughout the coronavirus pandemic. Every day you see the media trying to find a way to use the pandemic to damage President Trump. And every day when Democrat leadership does something regarding the virus response which might damage it, you find multiple media outlets either refusing to publish the information, slanting the information to benefit the Democrat side, or, as was done recently by the New York Times, initially publishing an accurate headline regarding the Democrat leadership holding up the coronavirus package, and then revising it twice to more favorably describe what the Democrat leaders had done. But the instances of media distortion are not limited to anti-Republican or anti-Trump motivation. Sometimes the sole motivation, or at least part of the mix, is the classic news media drive that's been held to derision for decades, frankly, for more than 100 years. It's the old saying, if it bleeds, it leads. Or if you want a pop culture reference that's a little bit more recent, look to Don Henley's classic tune, Dirty Laundry. The lyrics say it all. I make my living off the evening news. Just give me something I can use. People love it when you lose. They love dirty laundry. We got the bubble-headed bleach blonde who comes on at 5. She can tell you about the plane crash with a gleam in her eye. Dirty little secrets, dirty little lies. We got our dirty little fingers in everybody's pie. Love to cut you down to size. We love dirty laundry. We can do the innuendo. We can dance and sing. When it's said and done, we haven't told you a thing. We all know that crap is king. Give us dirty laundry. With Don Henley's insightful lyrics in mind, let's take a look at the way many media outlets have been reporting COVID-19 figures in the U.S. It was a huge adverse event when the U.S. leapt to the front of the line, passing all other countries to have the highest number of people infected with COVID-19. It was reported on endlessly, and it was, of course, true. Ignoring for the moment that reaching that conclusion means that we have to accept that China is telling us the truth about their coronavirus figures, both infected and dead, and I don't believe them for a moment. And if you do, I've got a few bridges and an original of the Declaration of Independence I'd like to sell you. I hear it has a treasure map on the back. Along with reporting that the U.S. has the highest number of coronavirus infections, some of the articles reported on the fact that the U.S. was still not completely ramped up in its coronavirus testing. But in reporting on that aspect of the virus response, the media chose to use a different statistical approach. What do I mean by that? Well, in what they would probably contend is just a coincidence, they chose to report the raw numbers of coronavirus infections, thus placing the U.S. at the top of the list, a list which nobody wants to be at the top of, ahead of Italy, Spain, Germany, Iran, and France. By choosing to use the raw numbers as opposed to per capita numbers, those journalists were able to place the U.S. at the top of that unfortunate list. Incidentally, if they had formulated a list on the per capita basis, because the U.S. is so much larger in terms of population than each of the top 6 countries, it would have been in 6th place, the bottom of that list of the top 6 countries. You'll find an analysis of this skewed reporting in an article by Matt Margolis entitled, What the Media Isn't Telling You About the United States Coronavirus Case Numbers. It appeared on March 27 in pjmedia.com, linked to Instapundit. But the most eye-opening aspect of the article is that it calls out the New York Times for publishing a series of slides in which one slide shows the raw numbers of confirmed cases in the U.S., thus, as I said, placing it at the top of the infamous list, But the next slide shows the number of coronavirus tests performed in the U.S., calculated on a per capita basis. So the U.S. looks worse than smaller countries like South Korea and Italy. If it bleeds, it leads. If it makes the U.S. or President Trump look bad, especially if it's running in a left-leaning paper like the New York Times, it's a go-to story. In the words of Don Henley, we all know that crap is king. Give us dirty laundry. I'll be back next week, not with laundry, dirty or otherwise, but with facts and informed opinions and commentary, and I hope you'll join me. Be sure to listen and to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. As I've mentioned before, the Political Spirits website is up and running. You'll find it at political-spirits.com. You'll find graphic cover pages for each new audio episode, and you'll find my bio, too. There are links to world news stories of interest and related articles, including one which I wrote for another conservative website explaining why I chose to start a podcast. And a discussion forum is coming soon. Incidentally, you'll also find the 11 maxims of political spirits. When you go to the page, be sure to subscribe. There's a lot of content there, and remember, all episodes are now on YouTube also, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell and select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.